Good evening. As you listen to the sound of my voice, you might begin to notice your breath deepening, slowing. Allow me to be your gentle guide tonight, effortlessly leading you through the landscapes of a time long past. There is nothing to understand, nothing to solve, only the gentle rhythm of a story. A story about the strange and shimmering world of the Dutch Golden Age, and a single flower that would, for a brief, bewildering moment, become more precious than gold. Before we drift too far, if you feel a connection to this place, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. Think of it not as a task, but as leaving a soft footprint in the sand before you continue your journey inward. If you feel moved, you could even leave a comment, letting me know which city you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. It's a quiet way of knowing we are all sharing this moment, from different corners of the world. Alright, let the shadows in your room grow long and soft. Maybe you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing. And together, let's allow the story to begin. The first thing you notice is the air. It's thick and heavy, a cocktail of scents you can almost taste. There's the sharp, reassuring smell of salt water and wet wood, the mineral tang of canal water, and underneath it all, the faint, exotic perfume of spices from lands you can only imagine. You find yourself standing on a bustling dock in what feels like the center of the world. It's the year 1634, and you are in Amsterdam. You have to be careful where you step. The cobblestones are slick, and the street is a chaotic dance of porters, merchants, sailors, and rumbling carts pulled by enormous, patient horses. The sound is a symphony of industry, hammers ringing on anvils in the distance, the rhythmic creak of cargo cranes, the calls of men in a dozen different languages, and the constant, gentle lapping of water against the stone quays. You look up, and the scale of it all is dizzying. A forest of masts rises from the harbor, the rigging like a complex web against the grey sky. These are the ships of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the world's first multinational corporation. They are fresh from the sea, their hulls stained by long journeys, and they are disgorging the wealth of the globe onto these docks. Silks from China, pepper from India, nutmeg from the Spice Islands, it all flows into the city's arteries. The warehouses that line the waterfront, their shutters thrown open like greedy mouths. The people here walk with a certain swagger, a confidence that borders on arrogance. These Dutch merchants, in their sober, black wool clothes and crisp white ruffs, look like serious, pious men. But their eyes are sharp, calculating. They walk as if they personally invented gravity and are quite pleased with the results. And in a way they have. They bent the rules of trade and finance to their will, creating a level of prosperity the world has never seen before. This is the Dutch Golden Age, and you are breathing its air. You wander away from the clamor of the port, deeper into the city. The famous canals, the G.R. Act and G. Ordell, curve around the old town in concentric rings. Here, the raw chaotic energy of the docks gives way to a kind of serene, monumental wealth. New houses are going up everywhere, tall and narrow with ornate gables that reach for the sky like proud declarations of success, a practical solution to the city's narrow staircases. But it's not just the spice trade that built this city. As you walk, you notice a less glamorous, more pervasive smell mixing with the other's fish. Before the exotic luxuries, it was the humble herring that laid the foundation for all this wealth. You learn a curious little fact: the Dutch dominance in the herring trade was thanks to a simple, almost secret invention from centuries earlier. A fisherman, a man whose name is now lost to all but the most dedicated historians, figured out a way to gut the fish at sea, a process called jibbing, removing the gills and part of the gullet but leaving the pancreas. The enzymes from the pancreas would then perfectly salt cure the fish in the barrel. This stroke of genius meant their ships could stay at sea for months, catching and preserving, while their competitors had to return to port. It was this mastery of a simple fish that gave them the confidence to then go and conquer the world's luxury market. It's a little reminder that grandest empires are often built on the most mundane foundations. Yet, as you admire the perfect reflections of the canal houses in the still green water, you start to notice the cracks in this golden facade. You see the opulence of the merchant class, but you also see the sailors with missing teeth, the women mending nets with calloused fingers, The beggars huddled in the alleys just a stone's throw from the new stock exchange. This leads to a question that historians still argue about today: was this society truly tolerant, or just pragmatic? It was a haven for refugees. Yes, a place where new ideas could flourish. But was that because of a deep-seated belief in freedom, or because a city built on trade simply couldn't afford to be picky? Money was the great equalizer, but only up to a point. Your worth was, quite literally, your net worth. It's a thought that lingers as you stand on a small bridge, watching the city thrum with energy. It feels powerful, unbreakable. Hungry energy. A city floating on this much new money is a city that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the next big thing. And that thing is just about to arrive. Not on a great ship, but as a small, unassuming bulb dug from the earth. You leave the bridge and find yourself drawn down a quieter street, away from the main commercial thoroughfares. Here, the houses are even grander, set back from the canal with small, impeccably manicured gardens in the front. It's through the wrought iron gate of one such garden that you first see it. Tucked away from the noise and the hustle, in a space of quiet, ordered wealth, stands a flower unlike any you've ever seen. The chaos of the docks feels a million miles away. Here, everything is meticulously planned. Gravel paths crunch softly under your feet, laid out in precise geometric patterns. Low-cut box hedges frame beds of flowers and herbs, arranged not for wild, romantic beauty, but with a kind of scientific curiosity. This isn't a garden for lounging, it's a living laboratory, a showcase of knowledge and refinement. The air smells of damp earth, fragrant leaves, and the subtle perfume of blossoms. It is the garden of a wealthy man, but not a merchant who deals in pepper and cloth. This is the domain of a connoisseur, a leaf-tub, a lover of rare and beautiful things. You see him at the far end of the garden. He is on his knees, not in prayer, but in devotion to a small patch of earth. H.E.S., an older gentleman dressed in the same dark, expensive wool as the merchants, but his focus is entirely different. H.E.S. not looking at a ledger or a shipping manifest. H.E.S. staring intently at a single flower. Curiosity pulls you closer. You walk quietly along the path, and as you approach, you see it. You've seen flowers before, of course. Common, cheerful things growing in pots on windowsills or wild in the fields outside the city walls. But this is something else entirely. It stands alone on a tall, elegant green stem. The flower is a cup of the most intense, saturated color you have ever seen. A deep, velvety crimson that seems to drink the gray light from the sky and burn into a glowing jewel. Its shape is perfect, a flawless chalice of 6 petals, so exquisitely formed they look as though they were carved from wax by a master sculptor. There are no blemishes, no ragged edges. It is a statement of pure, unapologetic beauty, as if it doesn't belong in this damp, northern European soil. You've just had your first encounter with a tulip. The gentleman, noticing your silent admiration, rises slowly from his knees, brushing the dirt from his trousers. He sees the awe on your face and smiles, a knowing, slightly smug smile. He begins to tell you about his prized possession. This flower, he explains, is a recent arrival, a guest from a far-off, almost mythical land. It comes from the gardens of the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople. An exotic treasure, a symbol of power and immense wealth from the Harvan Empire. He tells you the story of how it journeyed here, passed along by diplomats and botanists like a precious secret. He mentions the name Carolus Clausius, a famous professor of botany at the University of Leiden, who maintains a garden filled with these wonders. Clausius, he says, is the one who truly introduced the tulip to the discerning gentlemen of the Netherlands. He then shares a little piece of trivia, the kind of detail a true collector would know. The very name tulip, he says, comes from a misunderstanding. The flower's name is derived from the Persian word dul band, which means turban. Not was the sultans tucked the flowers into their turbans, but because the shape of the fully opened flower was thought to resemble the intricate folds of a turban, it seems almost comically mundane for something so magnificent. As you listen, you realize the flower's beauty is only part of its appeal. The other part is its story, its rarity. To own one is to own a piece of that exotic, faraway world. It's a way of saying, without uttering a word, that you are a person of taste, of learning, and of significant means. The bulbs, he tells you, are incredibly difficult to acquire. Professor Clausius is famously stingy with them, guarding his collection jealously. Some have even resorted to theft, raiding his garden in the dead of night to get their hands on these botanical jewels. And here a small crack of historical uncertainty appears, one that academics still proclaim. Was Carolus Clausius truly the single source, the patient zero of the Dutch love for tulips, or were other, less documented channels also at play, sailors and merchants on independent voyages also had contact with the Ottoman Empire? It's entirely possible that other bulbs from other sources were trickling into the country at the same time, their stories unrecorded. History, after all, is often written by the academics, not the smugglers. The official story credits the great botanist, but the truth might be a little messier, a little more democratic. For now, though, all you know is what you see before you. A perfect crimson cup on a single stem. It has no practical use. You can't spin it into cloth. You can't burn it for warmth. Its only function is to be beautiful, and yet, standing here in this quiet garden, you feel the pull of it. It's a new kind of desire. Not for something that makes you rich, but for something that shows you are rich. You look from the flower to the old man's proud face, and you see the first glimmer of the madness to come. It starts here not with greed, but with simple, obsessive love for a beautiful, useless thing. The gentleman in the garden, your guide into this new world of flowers, beckons you to look at another of his prized specimens. This one is different. It's not a solid block of color like the crimson one. This flower is a wild, unpredictable masterpiece. Its petals are creamy white, but they are slashed and feathered with streaks of deep, vibrant purple, like lightning captured in a bloom. The patterns are not uniform, each petal is a unique canvas, splashed with color as if by an impulsive artist. It is, you have to admit, even more breathtaking than the first one. This, the collector says with a reverent whisper, is a broken tulip. You find the term odd. Broken, it looks anything but broken. It looks enhanced. He explains that these rare, variegated flowers are the pinnacle of the tulip world. While a common, single-color tulip, what they call itself, is lovely, a broken one is a treasure. They are far rarer and thus far more valuable. He points to another, a pale rose color with delicate, spidey veins of white, and another, a brilliant yellow with flames of scarlet, licking up the edges of the petals, all unpredictable and all stunningly beautiful. The collector tells you that this is the true game for the connoisseurs. They plant their solid-colored bulbs and wait, season after season, hoping for one of them to magically break, to transform from a simple, beautiful flower into a unique work of art. No one, he tells you, knows why it happens. It is considered a gift of providence, a stroke of botanical luck. A grower might plant 100 red tulips and, if he is fortunate, one of them might emerge the next spring with these glorious, fiery streaks. That single transformed bulb is then worth 100 times more than its unchanged sisters. It's a lottery played out in soil and sunlight. And here you stumble upon one of the most fascinating and bizarre truths of the whole affair. A piece of knowledge we have now that they could only guess at. The beauty they so admired was, in fact, the symptom of a sickness. The magnificent breaking of the tulips was caused by a plant virus, specifically the tulip-breaking virus, or TBV. It was an infection, spread by aphids, that messed with the flower's color-producing genes, causing the pigment in the top layer of the petal to be suppressed in irregular patterns, allowing the underlying color, usually white or yellow, to show through. The most sought-after flowers in the Netherlands were, in essence, beautifully, gloriously ill. They were prized for their imperfection, for their genetic damage. This leads to a historical debate that's almost philosophical. Does it matter that they didn't know the cause as beauty diminished if its source is a pathogen? The collectors of the 1630s were practicing a kind of unintentional viral aesthetics. They built an entire market, an entire hierarchy of taste, around the random, beautiful symptoms of a plant disease. The connoisseur doesn't know any of this, of course. To him, this isn't pathology, it's magic. He tells you that there is no way to guarantee a break. You can't grow a broken tulip from seed. In fact, If you plant the seeds from a magnificent broken tulip, the resulting flowers will revert to a plain, solid color. The only way to propagate a broken tulip is to use the offsets, the small daughter bulbs that form from the main bulb. This makes them inherently rare and slow to multiply. You look at the beautiful, fevered flower, its petals streaked with the symptoms of its valuable disease. The entire system of value is based on a misunderstanding of nature. They are chasing a beautiful sickness, paying a fortune for a pestilence. The whole mania, you begin to suspect, is built on a magnificent, glorious, and very profitable misunderstanding of biology. The circle of tulip lovers grows, but for the first few years, it remains a rarefied hobby, a passion for the very wealthy. You see them in their elegant homes, gathered around a table, not to discuss business, but to admire a single, perfect bloom presented in a special vase. These are the botanists, the wealthy doctors, the most successful merchants, the 1% of the Dutch Golden Age. They have their own little societies, their own inside language. They publish catalogues with lavish illustrations of their favorite varieties, giving them grand and evocative names Admiral and Uri IJCK, Generalissimo, and the most coveted of all, the legendary Semper Augustus. You learn that this is, for now, an exclusive club. The price of a single, promising bulb is far beyond the reach of an ordinary person. At this stage, a quality bulb might cost 100 guilders. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman or carpenter or a stonemason might earn around 300 guilders in an entire year of hard labor. So to buy one of these bulbs would be to spend a third of your annual income on something you bury in the dirt and hope for the best. A hobby for those who have money to burn and a reputation to build. You witness a transaction firsthand. Two men are huddled in a corner speaking in low, confidential tones. One of them carefully unwraps a small cloth to reveal a single dormant tulip bulb. It looks to your untrained eye like a common onion. It's dry, papery, and utterly unremarkable, but the other man stares at it as if it's the coin or diamond. He inspects its shape, its weight, its color. They haggle quietly, not over price, but over a trade. The owner of the bulb agrees to part with it in exchange for a small, gleaming carriage, a carriage for an onion. And here you encounter another of the strange, almost unbelievable facts of this period. The early trades were often not for cash at all, but for barter. Bulbs were exchanged for land, for livestock, for works of art, or for commodities. This had a curious psychological effect. Trading a tangible thing like a carriage for another tangible thing like a bulb somehow felt less abstract, less like a pure financial gamble. It cloaked the speculation in the respectable guise of a simple exchange of goods, but it also made the price of the bulb sound even more dramatic. The news that a bulb was worth a carriage was a much better story than saying it was worth 1,000 guilders. It created a legend. This practice, however, leads to a point of contention for modern economic historians. How do you accurately measure the market value of something when so many transactions are one-off barters valuing a 17th century carriage or a specific parcel of land in modern currency is notoriously difficult? This is why some scholars argue that the most extreme prices cited in the popular stories of the mania might be exaggerated. They weren't based on a liquid cash market. Hard to value trades. Was the bulb really worth a house? Or was it just one man's house that he was willing to part with for one particular bulb on one particular day? The debate hinges on whether you see these as firm market prices, or as spectacular but isolated acts of economic theater. But in this moment, in this smoky room, there is no debate. There is only a growing consensus. These flowers are the new currency of status. Owning them separates the truly wealthy from the merely prosperous. It's a world of quiet obsession, of connoisseurs one-upping each other with rarer and more beautiful specimens. The circle is small, the stakes are high, and the general public can only press their noses to the glass and watch, mesmerized by the quiet, escalating madness of the rich. But the glass is about to crack. A few more months pass. The seasons are turning again. The brief spring has given way to the long warm days of summer. The tulips have withered, their petals falling away to leave behind stark, green seed pods. Now is the time for the harvest, not of wheat or rye, but of the bulbs themselves. You see it happening in the gardens of the wealthy connoisseurs. The stems are gone, and the men are now on their knees, carefully digging into the soft earth with small trowels, as if excavating precious artifacts. You find yourself in a different part of the city, away from the Grand Canal houses. This is a neighborhood of skilled artisans. You can hear the rhythmic tap-tap of a silversmith's hammer, the whir of a weaver's loom, the scrape of a cabinetmaker's plane. These are the master craftsmen of the Dutch Golden Age, men whose skills are respected throughout Europe. They are not as wealthy as the great merchants, but they are comfortable. They own their own homes, they led respectable lives, and they are members of powerful guilds. They are the solid, sensible backbone of the city. And it is here, in a small, tidy workshop, that you see the shift beginning to happen. You are talking to a weaver, a man renowned for his intricate tapestries. His workshop is a marvel of organized complexity, with spools of colored thread lining the walls. He is showing you a piece on his loom, a rich scene of a biblical story, when your eye catches something on a small table in the corner. Sitting on a piece of velvet cloth are two tulip bulbs. They are small and unassuming, looking for all the world like a pair of onions. You ask him about them. His expression changes. The professional pride he had when talking about his weaving is replaced by a different kind of excitement. A conspiratorial glint appears in his eye. He tells you he acquired them from a colleague, a dyer who has a small garden and a few connections. He paid a fair price, he assures you. Not a fortune, but more than he'd ever considered spending on something you can eat. It was an indulgence, a little taste of the high life. He plans to plant them in his small backyard plot this autumn. Then he leans in a little closer. He tells you that another weaver, a man who lives just 2 streets away, did the same thing last year. He bought a single bulb, a common yellow variety. He planted it. It bloomed. It was lovely. But when he dug it up this summer, he fanned off his, the original bulb, into small offsets. A friend of his, a baker, heard about it, advised you to buy the 2 smaller bulbs from him. He paid a good price, a surprisingly good price. For doing nothing more than putting a bulb in the ground had made back more than he originally paid, and he still had the original bulb for himself. He had effectively acquired a beautiful flower for free, with a small profit on the side. This story, you realize, is a virus of a different kind. It's spreading through the workshops and guilds of the city. It's a whisper in the taverns after work. It's a conversation over a neighbor's fence. The idea is dangerously simple. This isn't just a hobby for the rich anymore. This could be a business for the rest of us. The craftsmen, the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the shopkeepers. The crux, they see an opportunity. They don't have the capital to buy the rarest broken bulbs, the Gouda or the Viceroy, but they can afford the common selves, the solid-colored varieties. And if those bulbs multiply, and if the price for them is steadily rising, well, the math is not very complicated. You hear about a little-known subculture that's beginning to emerge. Groups of these middle-class tradesmen are forming informal syndicates. A weaver, a baker, a blacksmith, and a tailor might pool their money to buy a slightly better bulb than any of them could afford individually. They draw up a simple contract on a piece of paper, outlining each man's share. They entrust the bulb to the one with the best garden plot and weight. It's a new kind of investment, a homespun version of the joint stock companies that the great merchants used to fund their voyages. This leads to a question that historians have found fascinating. Were these small, informal partnerships a precursor to modern retail investing, or were they just an extension of the existing guild mentality, where members of the same trade would often collaborate on projects? The formal records are scarce, as these were handshake agreements made in back rooms, not official contracts filed with the city. Some see it as a grassroots financial revolution, the moment when the common man decided he could play the rich man's game. Others see it as just a temporary, localized fad, a folk version of a market that had no real structural importance. The truth is probably somewhere in between. It was a new idea, bubbling up from below, driven by a simple story. As you leave the weaver shop, you can feel the change in the city's atmosphere. The tulip conversation is no longer confined to the hushed tones of the connoisseurs. It's becoming louder, more open, more democratic. The desire is shifting. It's not just about owning a beautiful thing anymore. It's about owning and appreciating asset. The seed of speculation has been planted, not in a rich man's garden, but in the fertile ground of the city's ambitious middle class. The whisper is about to become a roar. You decide to follow the story of that first weaver, the one with the two little bulbs. You feel a strange sense of connection to him, a desire to see how his small wager plays out. Autumn arrives, painting the city in shades of ochre and rust. The weaver, true to his word, plants his two bulbs in the small, sunniest patch of his backyard, a space normally reserved for kitchen herbs. The winter is long and cold. The canals freeze over, and the city becomes a playground of skaters, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. Life goes on. The weaver continues to work at his loom, his hands moving with the familiar, steady rhythm of his craft. But you can tell something has changed. There's a new, quiet hum of anticipation under his daily routine. Every now and then, you see him glance out the window at the frozen patch of earth in his yard, as if he can see the magic sleeping beneath the frost. Finally, spring pushes through the cold ground. The ice on the canals begins to crack and groan, and the first green shoots appear across the city. The weaver's backyard is no exception. Too small, spear-like leaves pierce the soil. He tends to them with the obsessive care of a new father. He protects them from late frosts with a small cloth tent at night. He pulls every tiny weed that dares to grow near them. And then it happens. Two perfect, lemon-yellow tulips open to the sun. They are simple, elegant, and to the weaver, they are the most beautiful things he has ever seen. Not just because of their color, but because of what they represent: a risk taken, a winter endured, and a promise fulfilled. He brings his family out to admire them. He invites his neighbors. The flowers become a small celebrity on their quiet street. But the real excitement comes a few months later, in the summer, when the flowers have faded and the time comes to lift the bulbs. With trembling hands, he digs into the earth. He finds his two original bulbs, healthy and plump, and nestled beside them are for small offsets, for new bulbs. His investment has not just doubled, it has tripled. He takes two of the new, smaller bulbs to a local tavern. It's not one of the grand establishments on the main squares, but a cozy, dark-wood place where local craftsmen gather. He knows a guy who knows a guy. Word has gotten around. He lays the two small bulbs on the table. A small crowd gathers. These are not wealthy connoisseurs, they are men like him. A baker with flour dust still on his apron, a cobbler whose hands smell of leather and wax, a bricklayer with mortar under his fingernails, a man who works as a clerk in the city hall, a man with a steady but modest income, offers to buy them. They haggle for a bit the way men do, but it's good-natured. They finally agree on a price. The weaver walks out of the tavern with a small, but satisfactorily heavy, bag of silver coins. He has just made in one evening the equivalent of a month's wages from his loom. A month's wages for two small onions that grew in his backyard while he slept. The feeling is intoxicating. It's not like the slow, steady, predictable income from his weaving, which is earned through hours of painstaking labor. This felt effortless, like magic. He had outsmarted the system. He was no longer just a weaver, he was an investor, a player in the new game. He now has his original two bulbs back, plus two more small ones, and a pocket full of silver. He is, as they say, playing with house money. He immediately begins to think about next year. Maybe he should buy a few more bulbs, a different color, perhaps a variety with a more exotic name. And here you witness a fascinating and dangerous psychological phenomenon that behavioral economists now have a name for: the endowment effect. People tend to place a higher value on something they already own than its actual market value. The weaver's bulbs are no longer just bulbs to him. They are his bulbs. They are infused with the story of his success, with the thrill of that first easy profit. He wouldn't sell them now for the same price he paid for them. They are worth much more to him now. His perception of their value has been irrevocably altered by his ownership and his initial success. This feeling, you realize, is contagious. The clerk who bought the bulbs is now just as excited as the weaver was a year ago. The baker and the cobbler who watched the transaction are now wondering how they too can get in on the action. The story of the weaver's easy money, will be the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. You are no longer watching a single person's small gamble. You are watching the first spark of a wildfire, and the wind is starting to pick up. The days grow shorter, the air crisper. Autumn is settling over the city once more, and this is the season when the tulip trade should, by all rights, be sleepy and dormant. The bulbs are in the ground, tucked away for the winter. There is nothing to see, nothing to show. The flowers themselves are half a year away, a distant promise. But the buzz you felt in the tavern hasn't faded. In fact, it's getting stronger, more frantic. The game has changed again. You discover that people are no longer trading the bulbs themselves. They are trading the promise of bulbs. You are in a tavern, and you see a weaver approach a bricklayer. The weaver says, "I will sell you one of my yellow-crowned bulbs, to be delivered to you next June when I lift it from the ground." The bricklayer agrees on a price, let's say 60 guilders. They don't exchange a bulb because the bulb is currently buried in the weaver's backyard. They simply write down the agreement on a scrap of paper, a promissory note. Sometimes a couple of witnesses from the tavern will sign it. They call it wind handle, the wind trade, because they are trading nothing but air, a puff of wind. This is the moment the market detaches from reality. Before, you were buying a physical object, an onion you could hold in your hand. Now you are buying a concept, a piece of paper that represents a future flower. This innovation, if you can call it that, throws open the doors to pure speculation. The bricklayer who bought the contract for 60 guilders doesn't even need to wait until June. The very next week, in the same tavern, he can sell that same piece of paper to a tailor for 70 guilders. He has just made 10 guilders a week's wages for some without ever seeing, touching, or smelling a tulip. The piece of paper is the asset now, not the bulb. You see these transactions happening everywhere. The market is now open year-round, day and night. It doesn't need sunlight or soil. It just needs a steady supply of people willing to bet that the price will continue to rise. Here you encounter a truly bizarre and slightly comical detail of the wind trade. Because so many of these deals were happening among people who couldn't read or write, a system of signs and symbols was often used on the contracts. A simple drawing of a yellow tulip, next to the buyer's personal marker cross, a small drawing of a hammer, a star, would suffice. It was a folk market, running on trust and a shared, feverish belief. But this informality created a huge legal grey area, a point still debated by legal historians. Were these tavern contracts legally binding? Most had no official seal, no notary's signature. They were, in the eyes of the formal law, little more than gentlemen's agreements. Some argue this was a fatal flaw, a system built on sand. Others suggest it was a feature, not a bond. The lack of legal recourse meant your reputation was your bond, which, in the tight-knit guild community, was a powerful enforcement mechanism. You had to be trustworthy in all your other dealings. Others suggest it's simply a sign of how wild and out of control things had become. The profits were so intoxicating that people were willing to ignore the massive underlying risk that any buyer could simply walk away from a deal if the price fell. For now, with prices only going up, that risk seems theoretical, a distant cloud on a sunny day. You watch the bricklayer take his newly signed piece of paper. He tucks it into his jerkin. He has just spent more than a month's wages on a flower he has never seen, which is currently a lump of organic matter, buried in another man's garden, and his only proof of ownership is a legally worthless IOU. He orders another beer, a triumphant grin on his face. He doesn't look like a gambler who has just made a reckless bet. He looks like a genius. The wind trade transforms the market from a seasonal affair into a year-round obsession. It no longer matters if it's planting season or blooming season. The only season is the trading season. And because no physical bulbs are being exchanged, the trading can happen much faster. A single promissory note for a Viceroy bulb might be sold and resold 10 times in one afternoon, its price climbing with each transaction, while the bulb itself is sleeping soundly under a layer of winter frost, completely oblivious to the frenzy it is causing. The trade has become abstract, a game of numbers on paper, increasingly disconnected from the soil, the seasons, and the flower itself. The old formal exchanges where merchants traded grain and pepper are now seen as slow and boring. The real action, the thrilling, fast-paced trading that is making everyone rich, has found a new home, or rather, hundreds of new homes. The taverns of the Netherlands have become the new stock exchanges. You push open the heavy oak door of a place called the Fool's Garter. The name seems almost prophetic. The moment you step inside, you're hit by a wall of noise and smoke. The air is thick with the sweet, cloying smell of Dutch tobacco and spilled beer. The room is packed, shoulder to shoulder, with a chaotic cross-section of society. You see artisans from the guilds, their work clothes still on, standing next to clerks in their more formal attire. You see shopkeepers, sailors fresh off the boat, and even a few farmers who have come into the city, their faces ruddy from the country air. There is no order here. There's no central desk, no board with prices chalked up. The trading happens in small, frantic clusters of men. They call them colleges. A man will stand on a chair waving a piece of paper, a contract for a bulb to be delivered in 5 months, and shout out its name and an asking price. Bids are yelled back from the crowd. Voices are hoarse, faces are flushed with excitement and cheap gin. Money, or rather small down payments, are exchanged hand to hand. Promissory notes are signed on overturned barrels, the ink smudging from the condensation of a nearby tankard. It's an auction, a party, and a riot all rolled into one. A man sells a contract for a single Admiral Veneri IJCK bulb. He doesn't celebrate his profit by quietly putting the money in his purse. Instead, he follows a our local custom. HES expected to spend a portion of his earnings immediately on drinks and food for the others in his college. They call this wage coupon money. It's a fee, a commission paid not to a broker, but to the boisterous crowd. This serves a practical purpose. It keeps the mood festive and encourages everyone to keep trading. It also creates an intense social pressure. If you make a profit, you are expected to share the good fortune. It transforms a private financial transaction into a public celebration. You learn about the strange rituals and language that have sprung up around the trade. They have special handshakes to seal a deal. They use a complex slang for the different bulb varieties and contract types. It's a secret world with its own rules and culture, created on the fly in the back rooms of pubs. And this is where you stumble upon a quirky, and some would say telling detail. In many of these tavern-based colleges, a rule was established: all disputes had to be settled on the spot. If 2 men had a disagreement over a price or a signature, they couldn't leave the room until it was resolved. This was partly for practical reasons to prevent the chaos from spilling into the streets or the courts. But it also kept the action contained, creating a high-pressure environment where quick, emotional decisions were favored over slow, rational ones. The tavern was a world unto itself, an echo chamber where the only opinion that mattered was that prices would keep going up. This informal, chaotic setting is a subject of great interest for social historians. They debate whether the tavern environment was a cause or just a symptom of the mania. Did the drinking, the social pressure, and the lack of regulation create the speculative fever, or did the fever already exist? On the tavern's worst entry, the only available venue that would have it's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the space create the madness, or did the madness find the space? Whatever the answer, the effect is undeniable. Being in this room feels like being caught in a whirlpool. The constant noise, the press of the crowd, the sight of easy money being made and immediately spent on another round of drinks, it all works to suspend disbelief. In here, it doesn't feel like you're trading scraps of paper for imaginary flowers. It feels real, vibrant, and incredibly urgent. You see a young man, a printer's apprentice, his eyes wide with excitement, pool his meager savings with 2 of his friends to buy a fraction of a share in a single, unseen bulb. HES just joined the party, and in this room it feels like the party will never end. Even as the Comet Raider is swept up in the frenzy, the original connoisseurs continue to play their own, more elevated game. But the stories of their extravagant purchases trickle down and fuel the fire in the taverns. Every trader of a common bulb dreams that they might have the one that will break and become a masterpiece. They all know the legends, the names of the most unobtainable tulips, and one name stands above all others, so rare that only a dozen or so bulbs were known to exist in the entire country. Its name is whispered with a kind of religious oath: Emperor Augustus, always august, always noble. It is the king of tulips, the unicorn of the flower world. You never actually see the flower itself, and neither do most of the people talking about it. It's almost a mythical creature. But you hear the stories. You hear that a single bulb of the Emperor Augustus was sold for 5,500 guilders. To put that into context, a grand house on a fashionable Amsterdam canal would cost you about that much. A skilled worker would have to toil for more than a decade to earn that kind of money, a sum that elevates the bulb from a mere commodity into a legend. The stories of the Emperor Augustus function as a kind of marketing campaign for the entire mania. Every hopeful shoemaker or weaver who buys a cheap, common bulb for a few guilders harbors a secret dream. The dream is that through some miracle of nature, or as we know, a lucky aphid bite, their humble bulb will break and transform into something resembling the legendary Emperor Augustus. It's a botanical lottery ticket. The astronomical price of the Emperor Augustus acts as the jackpot, justifying all the smaller gambles being made every day in the taverns. It creates a sense of unlimited upside. Why settle for a 10% profit when you could, theoretically, hit 1,000,000%? But was the Emperor Augustus real? Oh, yes. It was a real variety. But the stories of its astronomical prices are where things get a little hazy for historians. The most famous transactions, the ones for thousands of guilders, were almost certainly not paid in cash. They were complex barter deals. One famous account lists the price of a single bulb being exchanged for 2 loads of wheat, 4 loads of rye for fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine for tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver beaker. This specific list, you learn, is one of the most debated pieces of evidence from the period. Did this trade actually happen? The account comes from a book written after the crash, a book intended to moralize and condemn the foolishness of the speculators. It's very possible the author simply invented this colorful list to make the speculations seem as absurd as possible. It makes a great story, but as historical fact, it's shaky. It's a piece of propaganda that has been repeated so often it's mistaken for a receipt. Historians who have tried to trace the ownership of the few Emperor Augustus bulbs find that they were held by a very small, very tight-knit group of elite connoisseurs who rarely sold them. They were the ultimate status symbol, and you don't sell the crown jewels unless you are truly desperate. So while its legendary price fueled the dreams of the common raiders, the bulb itself likely never participated in the frantic, common market of the taverns. It remained aloof, a distant, beautiful god-king whose very existence justified the faith of the masses. You are sitting in a tavern, nursing a small beer, and you hear 2 men arguing about the merits of a Gouda versus a viceroy. They are speaking with the passion and intricate knowledge of art critics. They discuss the flame patterns, the purity of the feathering S, the elegance of the stem. These are men who, a year ago, were probably discussing the price of fish or the quality of a shipment of timber. Now, they are aesthetes of the petal. And in the back of their minds, in the back of everyone's minds, is the ghost of the Emperor Augustus. It's the silent partner in every deal, the shining beacon that makes every risk seem rational. By the winter of 1636, the prices have gone parabolic. The collective delusion is at its peak. The value of bulbs is no longer measured in guilders, but in real estate. You are standing in front of a fine, brick-fronted house on a desirable street. It's a solid, respectable home for a prosperous merchant family. And you learn that this house, this collection of bricks and board shelter, was just traded for a single tulip bulb. The story is told everywhere. A man who owned the contract for a particularly fine viceroy bulb traded it to a man who owned this house. The deal was done. One family moved out, another moved in. A life's work, a family as security, an entire physical building, was deemed to be of equal value to one dormant flower bulb sitting in a pot of dirt. This, for many, is the emblematic moment of the mania. The point at which all connection to intrinsic value is severed. But as with so many of the most dramatic stories from this time, historians urge a bit of caution. While the trade for a house likely did happen, it wasn't a common occurrence. These were spectacular, headline-grabbing outliers, not everyday transactions. Yet, Their power was immense. The story of the house for a bulb becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If one bulb is worth a small farm and my neighbor's bulb is worth a windmill, the story sets a new, absurd benchmark for what seems possible. It stretches the boundaries of belief. And here you encounter another strange and slightly comical story, one that has become a famous anecdote of the era. It's the tale of a sailor, just returned from a long voyage. He has been at sea for months, perhaps years, completely unaware of the bizarre floral obsession that has gripped his homeland. He delivers a message to a wealthy merchant, and the merchant, pleased with the news, thanks him with a generous tip, a single, beautiful red herring for his breakfast. He spots what he thinks is an onion lying on the counter in the merchant's office. It looks a bit unusual, but it's roughly the right size and shape. Thinking it would make a fine accompaniment to his fish, he slips it into his pocket without a second thought. You can picture the scene: the sailor sitting on a crate by the docks, happily munching on his herring and the onion, savoring the taste of home. Meanwhile, the merchant discovers his prized viceroy, Tulip, a bulb worth enough to feed an entire ship's crew for a year, is missing. A frantic search ensues, and the sailor is found, wiping the last precious crumbs from his mouth. He is said to have been thrown in jail, though the duration of his sentence for consuming a small fortune is, perhaps mercifully, not recorded. Now, like the story of the bulb for a house, this tale of the world's most expensive onion is a source of historical debate. Did it actually happen? The story first appears in the same book written after the crash, the one filled with cautionary tales about the folly of speculators. There's no court record or contemporary account of a sailor being jailed for eating a tulip bulb. It sounds suspiciously like a parable, a story crafted to highlight the absurdity of it all. How could a society be so mad that something that looks like an onion is valued more than a man's freedom? It's a perfect piece of anti-speculation propaganda. And yet, whether it literally happened or not, a story has persisted for centuries because it captures a deeper truth about the mania. It illustrates the complete disconnect between the perceived value of these bulbs and their intrinsic, physical reality. To the sailor, it was a treasure. The madness was all in the mind. You look at the house again. You imagine the family who just moved out, packing up their lives, and handing it all over for a small, papery thing that now sits in a pot in the front garden. Did they feel like they'd made the deal of a lifetime, or did they have a moment of quiet, terrifying doubt in the winter of 1636? There is no room for doubt. Everyone knows someone who has gotten rich. The stories are everywhere. Is to risk being left behind. You look from the grand house to the small pot of dirt, and for the first time the sheer, dizzying absurdity of the moment hits you with the force of a physical blow. This can't last. It's impossible. But no one else seems to notice. The social fabric of the city is starting to fray at the edges, stretched thin by this new, all-consuming obsession. The rhythms of daily life, the steady, predictable cycles of work and rest that have governed this society for generations, are being disrupted. The mania is no longer a sideshow happening in taverns at night, it's taking over the main stage. You walk past the workshop of the shoemaker, a man whose family has been making fine leather shoes on this very street for 100 years. His shop is dark. A small, handwritten sign is tacked to the door, closed for business. But he hasn't fallen ill, and he hasn't moved away. You find him later in one of the crowded, noisy colleges, his face flushed, his leather apron exchanged for a slightly too ostentatious velvet double. HES no longer talking about the quality of Spanish leather or the best way to stitch a sole. HES arguing passionately about the future price of a tulip variety called SW it serves. He tells you his story, and it's a story you're hearing more and more often. He made a few small trades. He turned a small profit. Then he made a bigger trade and doubled his money. He did the math. In one afternoon of trading wind, he made more than he could in 2 months of hutchnig over his workbench, carefully crafting shoes. The conclusion to him was obvious. Hard work of his ancestors when you could make a fortune with a few scraps of paper and a bit of nerve. He has sold his workshop, his tools, his stock of leather, the legacy of his family, and has plunged it all into tulip futures. He believes he is on the verge of becoming a country gentleman. He is not alone. The weaver has put away his loom. The baker sells his shop. The farmer sells his land and livestock to move to the city and become a full-time trader. Lifelong professions, skills honed over decades, are being abandoned with a startling lack of sentiment. This is the moment the mania tips from a phenomenon into a social one. It's changing not just how people make money, but how they see themselves, their place in the world, and the very definition of work. You come across a rather curious and obscure detail from this period, the emergence of what some historians call tulip-themed art. It's not the grand, botanical still life you see in the museums painted for wealthy connoisseurs. This is something different, a kind of folk art. You see pamphlets and cheap prints being sold on the streets. They are satirical cartoons, often depicting people from all walks of life, from noblemen to chimney sweep, kneeling down and worshipping a giant tulip. One famous image shows Flora, the goddess of flowers, being pulled in a chariot of fools, gleefully throwing worthless bulbs to a grasping, desperate crowd. It's a sign that even in the midst of the frenzy, there was a current of self-awareness, a recognition that what was happening was, on some level, completely absurd. This leads to a fascinating debate among cultural historians. Was this art a form of genuine social critique, a warning against the folly of the crowds, or was it just another way to cash in on the craze after all? These prints and pamphlets were also being bought and sold, another commodity in a world where everything had a price. Some argue that these artists were the lonely voices of reason trying to hold up a mirror to their society's madness. Others suggest they were just savvy entrepreneurs, creating a product that tapped into the zeitgeist. They were selling the frisson of absurdity back to the very people participating in it, allowing them to laugh at their own obsession, even as they rushed back to the tavern to make another trade. It's possible to be both a participant and a cynical observer of your own folly. You see the effects of the shift in the smallest details of city life. The quality of bread seems to have gone down since the best baker became a tulip broker. It takes longer to get a horse race shod. There are whispers of merchants' guilds complaining that they can't find enough reliable craftsmen to complete their orders. The pursuit of instant wealth is eroding the foundations of patient, skilled labor that the Dutch Golden Age was built upon. The shoemaker claps you on the back, full of confidence and bonhomie. He tells you that work is for suckers, for people without vision. The future isn't in making things, it's in trading things. He is utterly, unshakably convinced that he is a financial genius who has discovered the secret to effortless prosperity. He, and thousands like him, are betting their entire existence on the price of a flower continuing to rise forever. They have abandoned the security of their past for a shimmering, uncertain future. They have stepped off solid ground and onto the wind. Amidst the roaring chorus of optimism, you begin to notice a few quiet, discordant notes. Not everyone is caught up in the dance. There are some who stand by the wall watching the frenzy with expressions not of envy, but of deep concern. These are the skeptics, the voices of reason in a city that has seemingly lost its mind. But their warnings are like whispers in a hurricane. You find one such man in a bookshop, a place that has become a sanctuary of silence in the noisy city. H.E.S., a university professor from Leiden, a man of lettered quiet contemplation. He is surrounded by the comforting, leathery smell of old books. He is not looking at price lists or contracts, he is reading Seneca. He sees you looking at the frantic crowd rushing past his window and gives a weary sigh. They believe they have found a shortcut to paradise, he says, not looking up from his book. But all they have found is a new and more elaborate way to be fools. He explains his reasoning, and it is devastatingly simple. The value of an object, he argues, should have some relationship to its utility or its intrinsic rarity. A house has value because you can live in it. Bread has value because it is scarce and does not tarnish. But these tulip bulbs, their only value, he says, is the collective belief that someone else will pay more for them tomorrow. It is a thing made of opinion, a fortress built on air. And when the wind changes direction, as it always does, the fortress will collapse. You start to see these dissenting voices pop up in other places if you look carefully. They take the form of anonymous pamphlets that appear mysteriously on church doors or are scattered in the markets at dawn. These are the satirical prints you saw earlier, but now you read the text that accompanies them. They are written in a sharp, witty, and often vicious style. They give the tulip traders mocking names like the bulb knights. They write dialogues where a wise, sober Dutchman named Gergo, Eid dealers goods argues with a frantic, foolish speculator named Warmond E.T. Truemouth or Chatterbox. Warmond E.T. babbles about infinite riches, while Gergo Eid E.T. calmly points out that you can't make soup from a tulip bulb. Here you learn a fascinating and obscure fact about these pamphlets. They are often considered the world's first examples of financial journalism, specifically a form of investigative, muckraking journalism. But they were also part of a much older Dutch literary tradition, the satirical dialogue. For centuries, Dutch writers had used this format to debate religious and moral questions. Now, they were adapting this old form to tackle a brand new subject, a financial bubble. They were trying to make sense of this bewildering new world using the cultural tools they already had. The very existence of these pamphlets raises a question that historians and literary scholars still debate. Who was writing them? And what was their true motive? Were they genuinely concerned moralists, like the professor in the bookshop, trying to save their countrymen from their own folly, or were they something else entirely? Some theories suggest that they were written by short sellers, speculators who were betting on the price of tulips to fall. They might have been trying to trigger the very collapse they were predicting, in order to profit from it. Another theory is that they were written by bitter, conservative members of the old guard, the landed aristocracy, who resented the new money being made by commoners and wanted to discredit their vulgar pursuit of wealth. Were these pamphlets moral warnings, savvy market manipulation, or just aristocratic snobbery without knowing the author's true identities? It's impossible to be sure. You see a group of traders in a tavern laughing at one of the cartoons. One of them, a butcher who now fancies himself a financial expert, holds it up. "Look," he bellows, "this poor fool thinks we're idiots. He doesn't understand the new economy." They use the pamphlet to light their pipes, turning the printed warning to ash and smoke. The warnings are not heard because they cannot be heard. To acknowledge the possibility that the professor and the pamphleteers are right is to acknowledge that your entire newfound fortune, your dreams of a country estate, your very identity as a financial genius, could be an illusion. It's too terrifying to contemplate. And so, the collective consciousness of the trading public develops a defense mechanism. They dismiss the skeptics as old-fashioned, as out of touch, as bitter failures who are simply jealous of their success. The warnings, instead of cooling the fever, only seem to make it hotter, adding a thrilling sense of defiance to the speculation. They are not just getting rich, they are proving the old fuddy-duddies wrong. They are the pioneers of a new age, and the Cassandras are just relics of the past. The party gets louder, a frantic, desperate crescendo, as if trying to drown out the quiet, persistent whisper of doubt. It is now the heart of winter, January of 1637. The canals are frozen solid, the city is draped in a blanket of snow, and the mood is one of feverish, almost delirious celebration. This is the peak, the absolute, dizzying, vertiginous summit of the mania. The prices have become unmoored from any semblance of reality, floating freely in the stratosphere of pure fantasy. You are at a grand banquet. It's not being held by an old money aristocrat, but by a man who 2 years ago was a modestly successful soap boiler. Now he is one of the new kings of the tulip trade. The room is a riot of excess. The tables are laden with food, the wine flows freely, and the light from a dozen chandeliers glitters on the velvet coats and jewel-encrusted rings of the guests. Every single person in this room is on paper fantastically wealthy. They have all unlocked the secret to effortless prosperity. The conversation is a bewildering babble of bulb names and astronomical figures. A man casually mentions that he sold a single Admiral Leifken's contract for a price that would buy 10 years of his old life. Another laughs about trading a quarter-acre of prime farmland for a bulb that hasn't even broken ground yet. They are drunk on wine, but more than that, they're drunk on success. They toast each other, their incredible good fortune to be alive in this moment. This isn't a market anymore, it's a religion. And tonight is the high holy day. You feel a giddy, disorienting sense of invincibility in the room. Every person here has a story of their own meteoric rise, and they tell them over and over, each story reinforcing the others. The weaver is here, no longer a humble artisan but a man of means, talking about buying an estate. The shoemaker is here, loudly explaining his plans to build a brand new house on the Haringrecht, the most prestigious canal in Amsterdam. The collective belief in their own genius is absolute. They have rewritten the rules of economics. Hard work is for the past. Patience is for fools. The future is a smooth, easy, upward line. In the midst of this celebration, you stumble upon a truly peculiar historical artifact of the Mania, new and highly specialized type of furniture. It is a tulip cabinet, ware being commissioned, made from the most expensive imported woods, with dozens of small, individual drawers. Each drawer was lined with velvet and was just big enough to hold a single, precious tulip bulb. It was a private treasury for their floral wealth, a piece of furniture designed to showcase a fortune that, for most of the year, was just a collection of dormant, onion-like objects. It's a stunning example of conspicuous consumption, a way to make the invisible wealth of the bulbs tangible and impressive even when the flowers themselves were not in bloom. But this opulent piece of furniture also highlights a central, ongoing debate for historians. What was the real scale of this thing? The popular story, the one you're experiencing right now, is of a nationwide madness that sucked in everyone from aristocrats to orphans and led to economic ruin. However, some revisionist historians argued that this picture is an exaggeration. They contend that the high-stakes trading was confined to a relatively small, though highly visible, group of wealthy merchants and speculators in the big cities. They point to records showing that the vast majority of the Dutch population, the farmers, the rural laborers, the urban poor, weren't ever involved. For them, life went on as usual. The price of bread and beer didn't fluctuate with the price of a viceroy bulb. In this view, Tulipomania wasn't a national economic catastrophe, but rather a dramatic, high-stakes game played by a specific subset of the population, whose spectacular losses were later amplified by moralizing writers. Was this a wildfire that swept the nation, or a bonfire that burned very hot, but was largely contained to a single field? The truth likely lies somewhere between the two extremes. But tonight in this room there is no room for revisionist history. The belief is universal and all-encompassing. The soap boiler raises his glass for a toast. To the tulip he roars, his voice thick with wine and emotion. The flower that has made us all kings. The room erupts in a deafening cheer. This is the final night of fools. The moment of maximum euphoria just before the fall. You look around at the laughing, triumphant faces, at the gaudy display of new wealth, and you feel a profound sense of unease. It's the feeling you get when you're standing on something that seems solid, but you can feel a faint, deep tremor beneath your feet. The party is at its loudest, the music at its most frenetic. It's the perfect, giddy, terrifying moment right at the top of the roller coaster, just before the plunge, and no one sees it coming. The end, when it comes, does not arrive with a dramatic crash or a thunderous explosion. It begins with a whimper, a small, almost insignificant event in a provincial town, far from the glittering hub of Amsterdam. It is the morning of February 3rd, 1637. You are in the city of Haarlem, in a tavern where a routine bulb auction is scheduled to take place. The room is filled with the usual crowd of traders, though perhaps a little sparser than a few weeks ago. The mood is still optimistic, but it's tinged with a slight exhaustion, the weary bravado of gamblers who have been at the table for too long. The auctioneer, a florid man with a booming voice, starts the proceedings. He offers up a parcel of common bulbs, nothing special but the kind of bread-and-butter commodity that has been trading briskly for months. He calls out the first price, and he is met with silence. A deep, profound, and deeply unsettling silence. The traders just look at each other. A few of them shift uncomfortably. No one raises a hand. No one shouts a bid. The auctioneer, flustered, lowers the price. Still silence. He lowers it again, his voice now laced with a note of pleading. Nothing. The price he is asking is far lower than what these same bulbs were fetching just last week, but the room remains frozen. A single, terrifying thought has just materialized in the room, seemingly all at once. It's a thought that has been suppressed for months, drowned out by the noise of the party. What if the price doesn't go up forever? What if this Is it what if the next person to buy is not a greater fool, but just a fool? The collective confidence, the very thing that has been holding this entire structure up, has evaporated in an instant. A man at the back of the room, who holds a contract to buy these very bulbs at a much higher price in a few months, starts to sweat. He looks at the man he is supposed to sell them to, and sees a flicker of panic in his eyes too. The chain of belief is broken. Here, you learn a strange and rather poignant detail about the aftermath. In the weeks that followed the crash, as traders desperately tried to find a way to honor or escape their contracts, a new product appeared on the market: Tulip Insurance. For a small fee, a company would offer to insure your bulb contracts, promising to cover a portion of your losses if the market fell. Of course, this was like selling fire insurance after the house has already burned down. Futile attempt to apply the rational tools of finance to a situation that was now governed by pure, irrational panic. It's a footnote in history, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of disaster, however useless. The failure of this single auction in Harlem is the subject of much historical debate. Was this truly the pin that pricked the bubble already deflating? And this was just the first place it became obvious. Some economic historians argue that the market was already showing signs of weakness for a week or two before this. Prices had plateaued. A few sophisticated, smart money investors had likely started to quietly cash out, selling their contracts to the last wave of unsuspecting optimists. The Harlem auction wasn't the cause of the crash, it was just the first public symptom of a disease that was already rampant. The patient was already dead. This was just the moment someone thought to check for a pulse. Others argue that the specific location was key. Harlem was a major center for the actual cultivation of tulips. The people there were growers, not just abstract traders. They had a closer connection to the physical reality of the bulbs. Perhaps the argument goes, they were the first to blink because their connection to the soil gave them a dose of reality that the wind traders in Amsterdam lacked. It's a romantic notion, but hard to prove. The news of what happened in Harlem doesn't travel by telegraph or telephone. It travels at the speed of a horse, a barge, a rumor. But it travels fast. The silence from that one tavern begins to spread. It's a contagion of greed that had preceded it. The auctioneer in Harlem declares the auction a failure and goes home. The traders file out of the tavern, not in a celebratory mob, but in small, quiet, anxious groups. They don't go to another tavern to continue trading. They go home to look at their stacks of paper contracts, which suddenly feel very, very different. Yesterday, they were treasure maps. Today, they might be worthless. The great giddy, glorious party is over. The silence that began in Harlem doesn't remain silent for long. It metastasizes into a low, anxious murmur, then into a rising clamor of panic. The news ripples through the frozen canals and icy streets, from one city to the next. The wildfire of greed has burned itself out, and now a backdraft of fear is sucking the air out of the economy. You are back in Amsterdam, in the Fool's Garter. The atmosphere is utterly transformed. The boisterous, celebratory chaos of a few weeks ago is gone. The air is still thick with smoke, but now it's the smoke of nervous, frantic pipe puffing. The room is still crowded, but the energy is different. It's not the giddy excitement of a party, it's the tense, desperate atmosphere of an emergency room. Men are huddled together, not to celebrate a deal but to anxiously discuss a rumor. Did you hear in Alkmaar? They can't even give them away. Someone in that tried to sell a Viceroy for a tenth of its peak price, and found no buyers. The names that were once whispered with reverence, Semper Augustus, Admiral Leif Kens, are now spoken with a tone of dread, like the names of powerful, vengeful ghosts. You see a man standing on a chair just as before. He is waving a contract for a Gouda bulb. A month ago, this piece of paper was worth a small fortune. He shouts out a price a fraction of what it was supposedly worth. No one responds. A man in the crowd laughs, a bitter, barking laugh. I wouldn't take it from you for free, he yells. It would indebt me. The man on the chair slumps defeated. His piece of paper is not just worthless, it's a liability. It represents a debt he now owes for a bulb he has no hope of selling. Panic is a physical thing in the room. You see men with pale, Sweaty faces, their eyes darting around wildly. You see others staring into their beer tankards with a kind of numb despair. The camaraderie of the boom has completely vanished. There are no more rounds of wage coupe being bought. The men who were slapping each other on the back a month ago now look at each other with suspicion and resentment. Every man in this room is connected to another by a chain of paper promises, and that chain is now pulling them all down. Here you discover a fascinating and slightly pathetic detail of the crash. In a desperate attempt to prop up the market, a group of prominent growers and dealers announced that they would honor all their contracts at a 10% discount. They thought this small, generous concession would stabilize prices and restore confidence. It was a classic case of trying to catch a falling knife. The market wasn't just down 10%, it had ceased to exist. Their offer was met with derision. It was like offering a 10% discount on a sinking ship. The gesture, meant to show strength, only revealed their desperation and accelerated the panic. This moment of collapse has led to a persistent debate among historians how many people were really bankrupted by the crash. The traditional story, fueled by the moralizing pamphlets written at the time, is one of widespread ruin. A nation of prosperous merchants and craftsmen reduced to poverty overnight. The shoemaker lost his shop, the weaver lost his loom, the soap boiler lost his mansion. However, more recent data-driven research suggests a more nuanced picture. Because so many of the trades were on paper, the wind trade, and the contracts were often legally unenforceable. Many of the losses were theoretical. You didn't lose the house you never actually owned. The bricklayer didn't have to pay the 60 guilders he had promised on a scrap of paper in a tavern. While some people who had sold real assets, their homes, their businesses were undoubtedly ruined, many of the smaller-time players simply walked away from their worthless contracts. The result was not necessarily mass bankruptcy, but a colossal, messy, and unresolved tangle of bad debts and broken promises. It was less a financial apocalypse and more of a great unFRI ending. You see the weaver, the man whose small initial success felt so magical. He is sitting alone in a corner, his face buried in his hands. He holds a stack of promissory notes, contracts to buy dozens of bulbs at prices that are now a sick joke. He had leveraged his initial winnings, and then he had borrowed from friends. He is, on paper, deeply in debt for a collection of flowers he has never seen and will never be able to sell. The easy, effortless profit has turned into a slow, grinding and very real loss. The silence spreads, but it is the silence of despair. The city is holding its breath again, not in anticipation of the next big thing, but in dread of the reckoning to come. The panic that started in the taverns now spills out into the open, transforming the very character of the city's streets. The abstract fear of numbers on a page becomes a concrete and personal reality. The social contract, like the financial ones, is breaking down. You walk through the marketplace, the Dam Square, the heart of Amsterdam. A few weeks ago, this was a place of confident, bustling commerce. Now the atmosphere is thick with tension. You see two men, formerly friends and trading partners, screaming at each other in the middle of the square. One is waving a crumpled contract in the other's face. You have to honor it. You shook my hand. We had witnesses. The first man shrieks, his voice thin with desperation. He is a baker, and he sold his oven to buy this contract. The second man, a tailor, shoves him away. Honor what a piece of paper, a puff of wind. You want me to pay a fortune for a worthless onion? You're mad. He spits back. A crowd gathers, but not to take sides or enforce some kind of communal justice, as they might have before. They just watch, a collection of anxious, worried faces. Each person in the crowd is either the baker or the tailor in their own private drama. They are all caught in the same web of broken promises. The friendly, optimistic community of speculators has fractured into 1,000 individual, bitter disputes. The concept of a man's word being his bond, which was the invisible grease that kept the wind trade moving, has evaporated. Trust has vanished from the city. Neighbors who once pooled their money to buy a bulb now cross the street to avoid each other. The guilds, those ancient brotherhoods of craftsmen, are torn apart by internal conflicts as members who speculated try to demand payment from members who are now insolvent. Amidst this social chaos, you learn about a peculiar and rather grim form of popular entertainment that emerged: the bankruptcy auction. When a merchant or speculator was officially declared bankrupt, all of his worldly possessions would be sold off at a public auction to pay his creditors. These became major social events. Crowds would gather to watch a man's life be dismantled piece by piece, and even his family's clothes were sold to the highest bidder. It was a brutal financial execution. This leads to a debate among social historians. Was the popularity of these events driven by pure, morbid curiosity and a sense of shared grim satisfaction in watching the high and mighty fall, or was there a more complex social function at play? Some argue these auctions served as a public morality play, a stark invisible warning to the rest of society about the dangers of greed and hubris. They reinforced the old virtues of thrift and caution by showcasing the brutal consequences of their opposites. It was a way for society to collectively process the trauma of the crash and re-establish its traditional values. Were people there to gloat, or were they there to learn a lesson? Probably a bit of both. You see the shoemaker, the man who abandoned his family trade to become a bold knight. He is no longer wearing his velvet doublet. He is back in his simple work clothes. His face is gaunt, his eyes hollow. He is not in a tub of his old shop, which now has a new owner. He just stands there, staring at the door, as if he could will his old life back into existence. He sold a certainty for a fantasy, and now the fantasy has dissolved, leaving him with nothing. The accusations fly, the blame game is in full swing. The small-time traders blame the big dealers for manipulating the market. The dealers blame the government for not stepping in to regulate things. Everyone blames the wind handle, the abstract nature of the trade, as if the contracts themselves were the villains, rather than the people who signed them. It's a frantic, desperate search for a scapegoat, for someone or something to hold responsible for this collective madness. But the truth is, there is no single villain. The baker is just as responsible as the tailor. The shoemaker has no one to blame but the man he saw in the mirror every morning. The enemy was not a person, it was an idea. And it was an idea that almost everyone had bought into. The chaos of the streets and taverns inevitably finds its way to the last bastion of order, the courts. The shouting matches and public accusations evolve into formal legal disputes. The desperate hope is that a judge, with his robes and his legal texts, can somehow untangle this colossal mess that greed and fear have created. You find yourself in the city hall of Amsterdam. The building itself is a symbol of Dutch power and confidence, but the atmosphere inside is one of confusion and frustration. The magistrates, these sober, respected pillars of the community, are overwhelmed. Their dockets are flooded with cases unlike any they have ever seen before. A plaintiff comes forward. Let's say he is a carpenter. He presents a promissory note, a contract for a tulip bulb, signed by a defendant, a cooper. The carpenter demands that the cooper pay him the agreed-upon price, 500 guilders for a generalissimo bulb. The price was agreed upon in November, at the height of the frenzy. The cooper, in his defense, argues that the contract is for a gambling debt. And Dutch law, he points out, does not enforce gambling debts. He argues that the wind handle was not a legitimate trade in goods, but a form of betting, no different from wagering on a game of cards in a back alley. He holds up a withered, sad-looking tulip bulb he bought yesterday for 2 guilders. This, he proclaims to the court, is the object he wants me to pay 500 guilders for. The magistrates are in a bind. They listen to case after case, each one a variation on the same theme. If they rule that the contracts are valid, they will enforce a wave of bankruptcies that could cripple the city's artisan class. Thousands of skilled workers would be ruined, forced to pay astronomical sums for worthless flowers. But if they rule that the contracts are nothing more than gambling debts, they risk undermining the very concept of a contract, the bedrock of Amsterdam's entire commercial empire. If a man's signature on a piece of paper can be dismissed so easily, what's to stop people from walking away from any deal that turns sour? This legal dilemma gives rise to a fascinating and quintessentially Dutch solution. The courts, for the most part, simply refuse to hear the cases. They kick the problem down the road. They issue vague rulings, suggesting that the parties should try to settle their disputes privately for a small percentage of the original contract price. They essentially tell the entire trading community, "You made this mess, you figure out how to clean it up." Here you stumble upon an obscure but important outcome of the crash: the professionalization of the role of the lawyer. Before the mania, legal disputes were often handled by amateur mediators or guild elders, but the complexity of the tulip contracts, with their chains of buyers and sellers, created a demand for specialists. A new class of sharp-witted legal experts emerged, men who knew how to navigate the murky waters of contract law and find loopholes for their clients. Some historians argue that the tulip crash, by creating such a massive and complex legal tangle, inadvertently helped to create the modern legal profession in the Netherlands. It was a boom time for lawyers, if for no one else. This reluctance of the High Courts to issue a definitive ruling is still a point of discussion for legal historians. Was it an act of judicial wisdom, a pragmatic attempt to avoid a greater social catastrophe by allowing the problem to slowly dissipate, or was it an act of cowardice, an abdication of responsibility? By not making a firm ruling, they avoided an immediate crisis but created a long period of legal uncertainty. Many of these disputes dragged on for years, with creditors endlessly chasing debtors through a maze of informal negotiations and lower-level arbitration panels. There was no clean resolution, just a slow, messy fizzle. You see the carpenter and the cooper leaving the city hall. There is no verdict. The judge has told them to go and work it out themselves. They stand on the steps, no longer shouting, just looking at each other with a kind of weary resignation. The legal system has offered them no salvation. They are still tied together by their worthless piece of paper, stuck in a financial purgatory. The law, it turns out, is no match for this kind of madness. It can't make a man pay an absurd price, and it can't erase a foolish promise. It can only step back and let the pieces fall where they may. The public drama of the crash, the shouting in the streets and the arguments in the courtrooms, eventually fades. It is replaced by a quiet, private reckoning. The mania was a collective experience, but the consequences are felt individually, behind the closed doors of homes all across the city. You find your way back to the small house of the weaver, the man whose journey you've been following from the very beginning. His story started with 2 small bulbs in his backyard, a symbol of hope and a taste of easy profit. Now, the aftermath of that dream has settled over his home like a layer of dust. The house is quiet. The loom in the corner of the main room, once the heart of the family's livelihood, stands silent and draped in a sheet. He hasn't had the heart or the orders to work it for weeks. He sits at his kitchen table. In front of him is a pile of papers, the promissory notes, the contracts, the IOS. This is the wreckage of his speculative career. Next to it is his small, pitiful pile of coins. This is what's left of his savings. He is doing a painful final calculation. He adds up the money he owes for bulbs he contracted to buy, bulbs whose value has now collapsed to virtually nothing. Then he adds up the money owed to him by people he sold contracts to, people who, he now knows, will never be able to pay him. The numbers on both sides of the ledger are fantasy, but the deficit they create is terrifyingly real. His wife is quietly mending clothes in the corner. She doesn't say anything. There are no accusations, no "I told you so's." There is only a heavy, shared silence. The excitement that filled the house when he brought home that first pocketful of silver from the tavern is a distant, bitter memory. The dream of a country estate, of a life of leisure, has evaporated, leaving behind the cold reality of debt and uncertainty. It's in this quiet, domestic setting that you learn about one of the lesser-known, but most insidious, consequences of the crash: the rise of the predatory moneylender. With the formal banks and guilds unwilling to lend to the disgraced speculators, a shadowy market for credit emerged. Men with capital would offer loans to the desperate, but at exorbitant interest rates, often demanding the deed to a house or a trade as collateral. Many who survived the initial crash with their homes and businesses intact ended up losing them months or years later, trapped in a cycle of debt to these opportunistic lenders. The mania created a new class of victims, long after the headlines had faded. This quiet, long-term fallout is a subject of debate for social historians. Did the Tulip Mania cause a lasting change in the Dutch national character? The popular narrative suggests that it did, that it shocked the Dutch back into their stereotypical virtues of thrift, caution, and sobriety. The experience was so traumatic, the story goes, that it inoculated them against speculative fevers for generations to come. However, other historians argue that this is too simplistic. They point out that the Dutch economy remained incredibly dynamic and risk-taking throughout the 17th century. The South Sea bubble and other speculative manias would grip Europe in the following century, and the Dutch were often participants. Perhaps the lesson learned wasn't never speculate, but rather be smarter about how you speculate. Was it a permanent scar on the national psyche, or just a painful but ultimately temporary lesson in market dynamics? The weaver gathers up the pile of worthless contracts. He doesn't tear them up in a fit of rage. He simply walks over to the cold fireplace and drops them in. He doesn't set them on fire. He just leaves them there, a pile of dead promises. He then walks over to the loom and pulls the sheet off. He runs his hand over the familiar wood. The two love his real trade, the one that had supported his family for years. He is not a ruined man, not in the dramatic sense of the bankruptcy auctions. He still has his house for now and his skill. But he has lost something intangible. He has lost his savings, his time, and his confidence. The easy money has cost him dearly. He was a weaver who dreamed of being a king, and now he is just a weaver again, but poorer and sadder and perhaps a little wiser. The fever has broken, and in its wake there is only the cold, clear, and difficult light of morning. Spring arrives again in the Netherlands. It comes as it always does, with a slow, undeniable persistence, washing the grey winter world with colour. And with the spring, the tulips return. You walk through the city, and you see them blooming in the gardens of the wealthy and in the small backyard plots of the artisans. A year ago, these flowers were the objects of a frantic, nationwide obsession. Every bloom was mentally tallied, its potential market value calculated, its future profits imagined. Now, they are just flowers again. You see a stunning, broken tulip, a swirl of scarlet and gold blooming in a pot on a widow's windowsill. Last year, a bulb that could produce such a flower might have been worth a small fortune. The widow might have been tempted to sell it, to trade this living beauty for a pile of guilders. Today, she just watches it and admires its beauty. Its value is no longer monetary, it has reverted to being purely aesthetic. The market for tulips has collapsed, but the tulip itself has been liberated. It no longer has to carry the heavy burden of human greed. It can just be a flower. In the countryside, you see the commercial growers, the men who had been at the heart of the supply chain. They are tending to their vast fields of color. They too have suffered immense losses. But their business is not entirely destroyed. The crucial difference is that they hold the actual, physical bulbs. While the speculators who traded in wind were left with nothing but worthless paper, the growers still have their living, blooming assets. Here you learn a surprising and often overlooked fact: the Dutch love affair with the tulip did not end with the crash of 1637. In fact, in a quieter, more rational way, it was just beginning. The crash destroyed the speculative market, but it did not destroy the horticultural one. The Netherlands went on to become, and remains to this day, the world's center for tulip cultivation. The knowledge and expertise that the growers developed during the mania, driven by the desire to create ever more beautiful and exotic varieties, formed the foundation of a legitimate, sustainable industry that has lasted for centuries. The madness gave birth to a stable and enduring trade. This leads to the final, and perhaps most significant, debate among historians concerning Tulipomania. Just how bad was it? Really, the traditional narrative, the one that has been told for centuries, is a story of national economic catastrophe. A devastating crash that ruined the country, halted the Dutch golden age in its tracks, and served as a timeless lesson in human folly. But a new wave of revisionist historians challenges this view forcefully. They argue that the story of Tulipomania as a national economic disaster is a myth. They point to several key pieces of evidence. First, as we've seen, the number of people who were legally bankrupted was likely quite small. Many debts were simply never paid. Second, the wider Dutch economy showed almost no signs of a major recession in the years following 637, the East India Company continued to make vast profits. The herring fleets still sailed. The painters of the Golden Age, like Rembrandt and Vermeer, continued to paint. Life, for most people, went on. These historians argued the crash was a spectacular, but ultimately marginal event. It was a storm that raged violently in the teacup of the emerging financial markets, but it didn't sink the great ship of the Dutch economy. Was Tulipomania the first great crash, a blueprint for all future financial bubbles, or was it just a bizarre, localized social phenomenon that was later exaggerated into a myth by moralizing writers and historians who loved a good story? The academic world is still deeply divided on this question. You see a child in a public park. She runs into a patch of common red and yellow tulips. She is laughing. She picks one and tucks it behind her ear. She is not thinking about its resale value or its cultivar name. She is not worried about a market crash. She just sees a pretty flower. The tulip has completed its strange journey. It arrived as an exotic treasure for the elite. It became a speculative commodity for the masses. And now, it is settling into its final, most enduring role, a simple, democratic, and beloved symbol of spring. The fever is over, the madness has passed, and the tulips, indifferent to the chaos they caused, bloom with a quiet, unassuming beauty. You find yourself standing on that same small bridge in Amsterdam, the one where you first felt the throbbing energy of the city. It's been a few years since the crash. The city looks much the same. The canal houses are still standing, the cranes are still hoisting cargo at the docks. The forest of masts still fills the harbour. The great engine of Dutch commerce has not, it seems, ground to a halt. And yet, something has changed. The swagger in people's walk seems a little less pronounced. The frantic, hungry ambition in the air has been tempered with a dose of caution. The city has been through a fever, and now in the quiet aftermath, it seems to be taking a long, collective breath. You reflect on the strange journey you've witnessed. It was a story about a flower at all. It was about us. It was about hope of perfectly sensible people can, step by logical step, walk themselves into a collective delusion. No one started out wanting to be a fool. The connoisseur just wanted to earn something beautiful and rare. The weaver just wanted to make a small, easy profit. The shoemaker just wanted a shortcut to a better life. Each individual step seemed rational at the time. It was only when you stood back and looked at the whole, dizzying structure that you could see the madness. The story of the Tulip Mania has become a kind of foundational myth for the modern world. It is the archetype, the cautionary tale that gets told and retold every time a new bubble inflates, whether it's in stocks, real estate, or digital currencies. The names change, but the music sounds eerily familiar. Here you learn one last, curious detail. The word millionaire did not exist during the time of the Tulip Mania. It would be invented in France in the next century to describe the speculators who got rich from the Mississippi bubble. However, the Dutch of the 17th century did have a special, new word for the kind of frantic, speculative trading that gripped their nation. They called it bol en razor nij bulb madness. It was a recognition, even at the time, that what was happening was not entirely rational. This leads to the final, enduring question that the Tulip Mania leaves us with, the question that historians, economists, and philosophers still wrestle with. Why does this keep happening? Are these bubbles an inevitable, recurring feature of human economic systems? Are they a bug in the code of capitalism? Or are they a feature, some argue, that they are the product of specific historical conditions, new financial instruments, a lack of regulation, a sudden influx of wealth? They believe that with better rules and more oversight, these manias can be prevented. But others argue that the root cause is not in our systems, but in ourselves. They see the bubbles as a product of timeless human psychology, our capacity for greed, our tendency towards herd behavior, our ability to believe in compelling stories, and our desperate desire for hope. As long as we are human, this argument goes, we will be susceptible to these fevers. We can regulate away human nature. The debate is, ultimately, about whether we are rational creatures who occasionally act irrationally, or emotional creatures who occasionally manage to act rationally. You look down from the bridge into the still, green water of the canal. You see the reflection of the tall, proud gabled houses. They look solid, permanent, unshakable, But you know that for a brief, bewildering moment, the value of one of these great houses was considered equal to a single, perishable flower bulb. It's a thought that is both absurd and deeply unsettling. The story of the Tulip Mania is a small, strange chapter in the grand sweep of history. It was a flash in the pan, a brief period of collective insanity that came and went. But it holds up a mirror to us. It reminds us how thin the veneer of rationality can be, how easily we can be swept up in a crowd, and how quickly a beautiful dream can become a waking nightmare. It's a lesson written not in the history book, but in the delicate, transient petals of a single flower. You revisit the people you met along this strange path, checking in on them now that the dust has truly settled. You find the wealthy connoisseur, the man who first showed you a tulip in his pristine, geometric garden. He is, in fact, remarkably unscathed by the whole affair. He gestures to a bed of blooming Semper Augustus, or at least, a variety that looks very much like it. He explains that he never sold his most prized bulbs during the peak of the frenzy. Why would he? He was a true lover of the flower, a leafdub. His goal was not to get rich, he was already rich. His goal was to possess the rarest and most beautiful specimens. The mania was a curious, and at times profitable, distraction, but it never touched the core of his collection. The wild price fluctuations were for the commoners, the wind traders, in the taverns. He and his small circle of elite collectors were playing a different game, one of a much longer term. His story highlights an often overlooked aspect of the bubble, the difference between the tulip lovers and the tulip traders. It was the traders, the ones who saw the bulbs purely as financial instruments, who were wiped out. The true collectors, who valued the flowers for their beauty and rarity, often held on to their best stock and rode out the storm. This is a subtle point that is often lost in the broad narrative of the crash. It wasn't just one market, it was at least operating in parallel with different motivations and different outcomes. Here you discover a fascinating little quirk of botany that would have infuriated the traders had they fully understood it. The broken tulips, the ones with the beautiful viral patterns, were notoriously weak. The virus that made them beautiful also made them frail. They produced offsets more slowly than healthy, single-color bulbs, and the bulbs themselves had a shorter lifespan. The most valuable offsets in the market were, from a biological standpoint, the most fragile and the least likely to multiply. The very engine of their perceived value was also the source of their eventual demise. It's a perfect, if cruel, metaphor for the mania itself. This leads to a quiet debate among art historians and economists. Did the elite connoisseurs, with their talk of secret knowledge and their hoarding of the rarest bulbs, deliberately help to create the bubble? Were they innocent bystanders who watched in bemusement as the common folk went mad, or were they active, if subtle, manipulators? Some argued that by creating an aura of extreme economical value around flowers like the Semper Augustus, they created the aspirational top of the market that fueled the speculation below. They may not have been in the taverns shouting bids, but they set the stage. Others maintain they were simply pursuing their hobby, and cannot be blamed for how the wider public misinterpreted their passion. It's the difference between being a fire starter and simply being the owner of a very shiny, flammable object that others choose to set alight. The line is thinned for centuries later, still blurry. The connoisseur plucks a single perfect bloom and hands it to you. A beautiful thing, is it not, he says. Its true value cannot be written on a contract. For him, nothing has really changed. He was rich before the mania, and he is rich after. He has his garden, his collection, and his quiet sense of superiority. He was insulated from the chaos by a wall of existing wealth and a genuine, obsessive love for the flower itself. He watched the storm from the comfort of his grand house, and now that it has passed, his garden is still in perfect order. You drift away from the grand gardens of the elite and back into the narrow streets of the working city. You want to know what became of the ordinary people, the ones who weren't cushioned by ancestral wealth. You find the tavern, the Foolsgarter. It's still here. The name, which once seemed like a funny coincidence, now feels like a permanent bitter joke. The place is much quieter now. The frantic energy is gone, replaced by a more subdued, weary atmosphere. Men still drink here after a long day's work, but the conversations are different. They talk about the price of lumber, the fishing catch, the health of a child. They talk about real things again. The phantom language of bulb futures has vanished from the room as if it were a dream. You see the bartender, the same man who was pouring drinks during the frenzy. HES wiping down the bar with a slow, rhythmic motion. You ask him about those days. He shakes his head and lets out a low chuckle. Madness, he says. Complete madness. For a year, every man who walked in that door thought he was a king. They would spend a month's wages on a round of drinks after selling a piece of paper. Now, he gestures around the quiet room. They count their coins before ordering a beer. He tells you a story, a small, sad anecdote that encapsulates the psychological hangover of the crash. He points to a man sitting alone in the corner, nursing a drink. That man, a skilled cabinamator, had been one of the most enthusiastic traders. He hadn't sold his shop, but he had lost all his savings. For a year after the crash, he couldn't bring himself to do any fine, detailed work. His hands, he said, still felt like they were shaking from the phantom thrill of the trade. The memory of the easy money made the slow, patient work of his craft feel pointless and unsatisfying. The mania had broken his bank account, but it had also broken his spirit, his professional pride. This leads you to a curious, and somewhat controversial, theory among some sociologists. They call it the hangover effect of a speculative bubble. They argue that the damage is not just financial, but psychological and cultural. A society that goes through a mania can lose its appreciation for real work, for delayed gratification, for the slow accumulation of value. It can create a generation of people who are always searching for the next shortcut, the next lottery ticket. The theory is difficult to prove, but it raises an interesting question. Does a bubble permanently alter a society's relationship with risk and work? Does the memory of the free lunch make all future, honestly earned meals taste a little bland? Historians who study public records from the period have noted a small, but statistically significant, spike in petty crime and bankruptcies in the 2 years following 1637. Not just during the crash itself. This would seem to support the hangover theory. These were not the big speculators, but ordinary people who were struggling with the secondary effects, the bad debts, the predatory loans, the disruption to their trades. The big dramatic crash was over in a matter of weeks, but the quiet, grinding aftershocks were felt for years. The story of the mania didn't end when the prices collapsed. It ended when the last desperate man sold his tools to pay a debt incurred on a flower he never saw. The cabinamator in the corner finishes his drink and leaves without a word to anyone. The bartender sighs. HES getting back to it now, he says. The work is slow, but it's honest. I think HES happier for it. The tavern is a place of healing now, a place where the feverish dreams are forgotten and the simple, hard realities of life are re-embraced. The madness has passed, leaving behind a scar and a story that the bartender will be telling for the rest of his life. You leave the city behind and travel out into the flat, green, and orderly landscape of the Dutch countryside. The mania was primarily an urban phenomenon, a fever that burned hottest in the crowded taverns and exchanges of Amsterdam and Haarlem. But its effects, you discover, rippled outwards, touching the lives of people who had never even seen a stock exchange. You find a small, prosperous-looking farm. The fields are well tended, the barn is in good repair, and the cows look fat and content. You speak to the farmer, a man with a weathered face and hands as tough as old leather. He tells you he never got involved in the tulip trade. He thought it was ridiculous from the start. You can't feed your family on flowers, he says with a shrug, but he was affected nonetheless. He tells you about his neighbor. The neighbor was a good farmer, but he got the fever. He saw the fortunes being made in the city and he wanted a piece of it. He sold 2 of his best milk cows, a significant part of his livelihood, to buy a handful of promising tulip bulbs. He planted them, dreaming of the day he would be able to sell them and buy a whole new herd, maybe even the farm next door. When the crash came, his bulbs were worthless. He was devastated. But the real problem was that he no longer had his 2 best cows. His farm's output dropped. He had trouble paying his taxes. He had to sell a small parcel of his land to the farmer you were speaking with just to make ends meet. The sober farmer didn't gloat. He felt sorry for his neighbor. He tried to climb a ladder made of smoke, he says, and he forgot about the solid ground under his feet. This story illustrates the secondary impact of the crash, the ripple effect on the real economy. The capital that was vaporized in the tulip market was capital that could have been invested in land, in ships, in new farming equipment. The mania diverted resources and human energy away from productive enterprises and into a zero-sum game of speculation. This brings you to a small but revealing historical detail: the impact of the mania on the Dutch diet. For a brief period, at the height of the craze, some archival records show a slight increase in the price of certain basic goods, like cheese and butter in cities like Haarlem. Why? Because some farmers had been tempted to sell their dairy cows to raise cash for tulip speculation. The reduction in the number of cows led to a small, temporary reduction in the supply of dairy products, which in turn nudged the prices up. It's a tiny, almost invisible footprint in the economic data, but it shows how the abstract financial mania could have a real, tangible effect on what people put on their dinner tables. This very point is part of an ongoing academic discussion. To what extent did the tulip mania divert capital from more productive sectors of the Dutch Golden Age economy? The revisionist historians, who argue the crash was a minor event, say the impact was negligible. The Dutch economy was so large and diverse that the capital lost in the tulip market was a mere drop in the bucket. But other, more traditional economic historians argue that the diversion was significant. They suggest that the mania represented a massive misallocation of resources that could have, for example, funded several extra voyages for the East India Company or financed the draining of a new polder. Could the Dutch Golden Age have been even more golden without this flowery distraction? It's a classic what-if of history, impossible to answer definitively. The farmer looks out over his fields. The sun is setting, casting a long, golden light over the land. His neighbor's farm is still there, but it's smaller now, a little less prosperous. The invisible financial storm that swept through the cities left a permanent mark on the physical landscape here. The mania read not just the ledgers in Amsterdam, but the property lines in the countryside. It was a silent, powerful force that rewarded caution and punished ambition, leaving behind a lesson etched into the very earth. Your journey is nearing its end. You have seen the rise and fall, the madness and the aftermath. Now, you seek a place of quiet reflection, a place to make sense of the story. You find yourself in a painter's studio. It is the studio of one of the great masters of the Dutch Golden Age. The room smells wonderfully of linseed oil, turpentine, and wood smoke from the small stove in the corner. Canvases in various states of completion are propped against the walls. The light from a large, north-facing window falls softly on an easel in the center of the room. On the easel is a still-life painting of Anita's. It is a masterpiece of breathtaking realism. You see a human skull, its empty eye sockets staring out at you. Next to it, a guttering candle sends a thin wisp of smoke into the air. An hourglass has almost run its course. Eye book lies open. Its page is ruffled. And there, in a beautiful glass vase, is a single perfect, broken tulip, its petals already starting to wilt and curl at the edges. The painting is a sermon in oils. The message is clear, a classic memento mori: remember that you must die. All earthly things, wealth, knowledge, beauty, life itself are transient. The skull is the ultimate symbol of mortality. The hourglass and the candle represent the fleeting nature of time. And the tulip has a special role here. In the years after 1637, the tulip became the ultimate symbol of folly and the ephemeral ity of worldly wealth. Its beauty is intense, but it fades in days. Its value was once astronomical, but it vanished overnight. It is the perfect emblem for Anita's painting. You learn a fascinating tidbit from the artist. Before the mania, the most common flower used in these paintings to symbolize the transience of life was the rose, with its tendency to drop its petals quickly. But after the crash, the tulip, especially the broken tulip, usurped the rose's position. It came to carry a double meaning, not just the general fleetingness of beauty, but the specific, foolish vanity of speculation and earthly greed. The mania had permanently changed the symbolic language of art. This, of course, is a point of some art historical debate. Did artists begin using the tulip as a symbol of folly because of the crash, or were they already using it that way, and the crash simply amplified a pre-existing meaning? Some scholars argue that the exotic, for nature of the tulip already marked it as a symbol of worldly, and therefore suspect, luxury long before the bubble. They contend that the Venitas painters weren't reacting to the news of the crash, but were simply continuing a well-established tradition. Others insist that the shift is too dramatic to be a coincidence. The sheer number of tulips that appear in still-life paintings dated to the years immediately following 1637 suggests a direct and deliberate commentary on the recent madness. It's a debate about whether art reflects its time, or simply reflects other art. The painter stands back from his work, his brush in hand. He is not a speculator or a merchant. He is an observer, a chronicler of his time. He saw the madness unfold. He saw the man in the taverns, the desperation in the courts, the quiet despair in the homes, and he has distilled it all into this one silent, powerful image. The painting is not a loud condemnation. It's a quiet, melancholic reflection. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And its whisper has echoed through the centuries. While the contracts and the promissory notes have long since turned to dust, this painting remains. The financial wealth of the mania was an illusion that evaporated in an instant. But the cultural wealth it produced, the stories, the art, the lessons, has proven to be remarkably durable. You look at the painted tulip, forever captured at the moment of its most perfect beauty, just before its inevitable decay. It is the entire story in a single image. The beauty, the desire, the folly, and the inescapable truth that all of it shall pass. And so you find yourself back where you started, in the present moment, leaving the 17th century behind. The echoes of the story, however, remain. You've walked the slick cobblestones of Amsterdam, stood in the smoky taverns, and felt the dizzying pull of a crowd that has lost its collective mind. You've seen how a simple, beautiful object can become a screen onto which people project their wildest dreams of wealth and status. You are left with the final, enduring legacy of the Tulip Mania, the story itself. It has become more than a historical event. It is a parable, a timeless narrative about human nature. It's a story that we tell ourselves to this day, a touchstone we use to try and understand the booms and busts of our own time. Every time a new speculative frenzy takes hold, the ghost of the tulip frenzy takes hold. The ghost of the Tulip Mania, we ask. The phrase itself has become shorthand for irrational exuberance, for a bubble detached from all reality. You learn one final ironic fact. In the modern world, some of the rarest and most historically significant tulip varieties, the descendants of the very bulbs that were raided in the 1632, are preserved in special horticultural collections. A single bulb of a rare historic variety can, once again, sell for a very high price. Not enough to buy a house, perhaps, but certainly a significant sum, paid by modern-day connoisseurs and collectors. The wheel has turned full circle. The tulip, for a select few, is once again a rare and prized possession, its value tied to its history and its story. This brings us to the last great debate that swirls around this topic. Is the story we tell about Tulipomania actually true? The revisionist historians have made a compelling case that the popular version, the tale of a national economic catastrophe that ruined thousands, is a myth, an exaggeration built on the shaky foundations of post-crash propaganda. They argue that the real Tulipomania was a much smaller, more contained event, and that its enduring power comes not from its historical impact, but from the quality of the story itself. It's a perfect narrative, with clear heroes, the skeptics, villains, the greedy speculators, and a powerful moral lesson. So are we remembering a historical event, or are we just endlessly repeating a very good, but not entirely accurate, story? The debate is between history as a record of what happened, and history as a collection of stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. Perhaps the Tulip Mania's greatest is not economic, but narrative. Its true value in the end was not in the bulbs, but in the lesson. A lesson that was so powerful, we may have embellished the facts just to make it even better. You are left with this thought. The story of the Tulip Mania is like one of its own broken tulips. The core of it, the historical truth, is the simple, solid-colored bulb. But over the centuries we have added our own slashes and feathers of drama, of moralizing, of myth-making. We've made the story more beautiful, more spectacular, more memorable. And just like the 17th century collectors, we have fallen in love with the beautiful broken version of the tale. We prefer the myth to the reality because it teaches us a more profound lesson about ourselves. It's a reminder that our desire for a good story can be just as powerful and just as distorting as our desire for gold or for a single, perfect flower. And so the story gently fades. The canals of Amsterdam recede into a soft mist, the shouts of the tavern grow quiet, and the vibrant colors of the tulips dissolve into the gentle darkness behind your eyelids. All the details, the names, the numbers, they can all drift away now, like petals on a soft breeze. They are not important. What remains is just a feeling, a sense of a story told, a journey completed. You can feel the gentle weight of your own body, supported, comfortable, and at peace. The frantic energy of the mania has been replaced by a deep and profound stillness, a quiet that belongs only to you. Let the silence in the room be a soft blanket, wrapping you in comfort. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to think about. Your mind, like the Dutch market after the crash, can finally be at rest. It can return to its true value, which is this state of quiet, effortless being. Imagine yourself now, drifting on a calm, still canal. The water is like dark glass, and the moon is reflected on its surface. Each gentle ripple is a passing thought, and you can just watch it spread and then disappear, leaving the water still and calm once more. There is no destination on this canal. There is only the gentle, rhythmic motion of the boat, rocking you slowly, softly deeper into rest. The story is over, and now the quiet is yours. And here my voice will grow quiet. But if you still need its company, it's ready for you in another story. If not, I wish you a silent, star-filled night. Good night.